Welcome to our next AYSRH Office Hours series hosted by the Challenge Initiative. We'll be starting in about 5 minutes or so, so please put yourselves on mute and grab some coffee or tea, and we'll be starting shortly. Thank you. Just want to welcome those who've signed in so far. It's about 9:57, so we'll give folks about another 3 to 5 minutes to log in, and then we'll get started promptly after the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'd like to welcome you all today. My name is Lisa Moicambo. I'm a Senior Program Officer at Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, supporting the Challenge Initiative. Today we will be hosting our third in a series of webinars, what we're calling our AYSRH Office Hours series. So the Challenge Initiative is a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded initiative aimed to sustainably scale up evidence-based approaches to increase the use of modern contraceptive methods among all women 15 to 49 years of age residing in urban poor areas. This includes a special focus on empowering young people by improving their knowledge and attitudes about contraception methods, improving their self-efficacy to use and access contraceptives, and creating an enabling environment that allows them to freely obtain informed choice contraceptive services. We started this webinar series after we hosted an AYSRH Master Training of Trainers and Coaches, and largely because we know that a one-off workshop or training is not enough. So we've invited implementing partners and experts in the field of adolescent youth sexual reproductive health and rights to share with us more detailed knowledge about evidence-based AYSRH programming in a number of areas. Today, we will focus on meaningful youth engagement in sexual reproductive health and rights. In today's webinar, the presenter will focus on effective approaches and useful tools for engaging young people in building youth leadership capacity, key principles, promising practices, and programmatic learnings, and translating these learnings to inform AYSRH programs and current limitations. For audio recordings of our previous webinars, those can be found at tciurbanhealth.org under TCI News. It's part of our blog post series. Today's speaker, I'd like to welcome and introduce you to Lindsay Menard-Freeman, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Torchlight Collective, bringing nearly a decade of activism, organizing, and forceful optimism to her work with young people in sexual and reproductive health and rights. She has served as an advocate and communicator at the intersection of youth mobilization, SRHR, movement building, and global health. Prior to transitioning into consulting in August 2015, Lindsay worked for over 3 years as the Senior Manager of Youth Programs and Advocacy at Women Deliver, where she designed, led, and raised funds for the Young Leaders Program. And for 4 years in the Global HIV Response as the Program Manager with the Global Youth Coalition on HIV/AIDS. Lindsay is a Senior Editor at SheWrites.com, an online feminist publication, and her blogs appear in Huffington Post and RH Reality Check. She has a master's degree in Human Rights Studies from Columbia University, where she wrote her thesis on sex workers' rights organizing, and a BA from the University of New Hampshire, where she double majored in English and Women's Studies. For today's webinar, I just wanted to go over kind of some of the logistics. The presentation will be about 30 minutes or so. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box. Depending on your screen, it might be actually at the top tools bar, or it could be at the bottom. You just need to move your mouse and kind of hover around the top or the bottom edges. As the moderator, I will do my best to kind of collect and consolidate questions along with some of my colleagues on the TCI team. And then we'll pose those questions to Lindsay towards the end of her presentation. We'll try to address as many as possible during this webinar, and we'll also make sure to send the recording afterwards in a few days. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and hand over the reins to Lindsay, where we will learn more.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you wonderfully.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. Good morning from Nashville, Tennessee. I want to just start out really quickly by thanking TCI for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for joining. This would be a lonely webinar if none of you were here. And I feel very honored to be talking about this topic. I think this is a really timely moment, and I'm also really excited to chat with you all during the Q&A. I wanted to also just start by saying that I feel like I learned a lot about my own thinking as I was preparing this webinar slide, and it made me realize, and I just was confronted with the fact that there are a lot of really smart people who are contributing to this conversation about meaningful youth engagement, especially as it relates to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I'm going to try my best to cram as much into 30 minutes as I can. And there's probably some assumptions I'm operating under, and I hope we can sort of really dig into that during the Q&A. And before, also one last thing before we get started, I also just wanted to say that Torchlight and my background is largely around supporting youth-led advocacy for policy change. And so I know a lot of folks on the webinar may be service delivery folks and program implementers, and I'm really excited to hear from all of you as well, but just wanted to orient us in that way, that there's some things in here that may be geared specifically for advocates and policy folks. So I just wanted to say that from the kickoff. So I thought it would be helpful, Lisa, I'm on slide 6. I thought it'd be helpful to, slide 7, just to give some context about who I am and who Torchlight is, just, why the heck are we here talking about this? And so if you go to the next slide, Lisa, essentially the joke that we kind of make on our team, and I feel like we can make this joke because we're reproductive health folks, is that if a freelancers union and a consulting firm had a baby, planned their family had a baby, we would sort of, you would have Torchlight. We're not a traditional consulting firm, but we are all a group of freelancers who all happen to be working together around the same time. And many of us met in a range of youth movements, SRHR movements, as youth advocates ourselves. We're about 13 in 7 countries, and we all kind of like give a side eye to the term consultant, but here we are. And I would say that one of the benefits of being an old young person, an aged out young person, aged out youth advocate, is that we've sort of seen some of the evolution of this conversation, and that in and of itself makes me feel old. But just to say that there's been some interesting touch points along the way in I would say, over the last 10 years, and I'm sort of excited to kind of touch on some of those. Moving to the next slide, wanting to sort of also orient kind of what we're doing here today, also for myself, what are we doing here? And so to start off with just the objectives, I know Lisa shared this in the webinar announcement, but just to review them, just wanted to share a brief history of youth engagement, meaningful youth engagement, for various programmatic considerations and learnings, just to kind of review where we've come, describe some promising approaches that some of it is grounded in the work that Torchlight has done over the last 2 years with some youth-led SRHR advocacy coalitions, to kind of talk about that a little bit, and sort of what that's meant for youth engagement and building youth leadership, and then sort of provide some brief next steps and in the best way that we can of how these learnings sort of contribute to and inform AYSRH programming, and some of those limitations. So I also just wanted to, thanks Lisa for that next slide. Just wanted to kind of, I imagine many of you on this webinar are also folks who either work with adolescents and young people, maybe you are adolescents and young people yourselves, you work for youth-led organizations or coalitions or networks, and so some of this may be pretty basic, but I feel like it would be helpful to have these 3 kind of principles laid out at the beginning. So we at Torchlight are really keen on framing youth engagement specifically and truly from a human rights-based perspective. Young people have the right to be at the table, sort of talking about their experiences and perspectives, especially as it informs, programs and policies that affect them, funding priorities that affect them. So really grounding this work in that. For those folks who are designing programs and thinking about policy or funding, young people and youth are our customers. I think that, you know, I don't have a ton of experience in the business world, but there's one thing I feel like I've seen that the private sector wouldn't necessarily put out a product that they hadn't tested with its market, and so we shouldn't really be designing and conceptualizing and, you know, working on a lot of these programs without the input of adolescents and young people, because ultimately they are obviously more than just targets and beneficiaries, but they're the folks consuming services and information, and, you know, obviously we want to make sure we're getting it right. And the third is that I think, you know, this is also a really crucial moment to really be digging into some of the principles of meaningful youth engagement, simply because there's a lot of really good, you know, youth activism that's happening right now. There's a lot of, you know, I think recognition that young people are a key demographic. And so how do we kind of really look at, you know, look at this conversation and make sure that, you know, the voices of folks who are being affected are included. And I sort of, there's a little bit of urgency, I feel, in that way. I just wanted to make a note too, that I'm really not necessarily talking about adolescents specifically in a lot of this presentation, mostly because there are some really solid and important child protection principles that should come into play when you're engaging with adolescents. And so I just want to kind of caveat that from the beginning, but there are some really good examples of adolescent engagement that are worth sharing if folks are interested. Just wanted to call that out. Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, yes. So this is similarly to the last slide. I also just wanted to frame, if you all sleep through the next 15 minutes, which you're welcome to take a nap on this webinar, but if you sleep through the whole thing and take away nothing, I wanted to put these 3 takeaways up front, mostly, again, just to ground the conversation. I think when we're talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights for youth, we're talking about a lot of power issues. We're talking about things like sexuality. We're talking about reproductive justice, you know, and within that conversation, you know, we need to look at who is making decisions, who is determining where money flows, who is, you know, designing programs. And, you know, a lot of the SRHR issues that we're talking about with youth will not really change until some of those power dynamics are really sort of uprooted and sort of rototilled in this way. And this means, you know, making sure that adolescents, but also youth, are not sort of framed as beneficiaries or the subject, but are in fact put at the driver's seat. I know this is probably some, you know, water to the fish to many of you, but just articulating it clearly. The second being that a lot of youth engagement efforts are kind of either, you know, something's been designed and they're like, oh, we should actually talk to some young people now that we've, you know, designed this, so let's make sure we're validating with young people, and wanting to really drive home that really truly meaningful youth engagement, it really needs to be embedded, it needs to be budgeted for, it needs to be resourced with staff people, you know, so making sure that it's not sort of like a tweet chat or a flash mob or, you know, all of the, you know, some add-on activities that end up counting as youth engagement. And then the third thing, I think I gave Lisa a heart attack when I put this point in, but I have an explanation. I imagine that many folks on here are researchers and work with data and are, you know, building programs around, you know, and solutions around evidence, and that's fantastic. The evidence that I'm talking about specifically here is around the, you know, I'm making air quotes right now, but the efficacy of youth engagement. So what success metrics look like, right? So what sort of, like, when you're talking about engaging youth, is there evidence to show that that will lead to certain outcomes? And there isn't a lot of evidence and data to show that, you know, there are reasons to engage young people. And it's complicated, but part of it is, I think that there are some there is some evidence that we need to try to collect as a community to help make different types of cases to have young people at the table. So those are the three main takeaways, I would say, and we'll revisit them, but just wanted to start with that. The next slide, I just wanted to do a quick definition of that we sort of work with. Lisa, I'm on slide 12. And this is IPPF's definition of youth-centered. There are not, I haven't really found sort of a perfect definition of youth engagement and participation and youth-centered, you know, but I think that this is a really good one that specifically talks about, you know, young people's agency in their own lives and what transformation kind of looks like from the youth perspective outward versus, you know, framed, you know, by the community or by the sector sort of in to communities of young people. So I found this definition to be really helpful. So just to say, yes, so a really brief history. And again, like I know that a lot of folks on this webinar may know a lot of this, so I'm gonna be very brief here and happy to share resources after the webinar, but just to sort of run through this. So we wanted to put together a timeline of some key kind of moments that really, I think, bolstered the conversation around youth engagement starting back in 1999. And I don't know if this is easy to read for folks. So again, we can share this in a more user-friendly format. But essentially, these are just, you know, key international organizations and UN agencies or processes that really took an intentional effort to focus on and be centered around and framed by young people, or, you know, that really sort of push forward the conversation. I think that it goes up to 2016, but there are obviously part of, you know, why this is kind of a quick hit timeline is that there's actually been a lot, I would say, over the last 3 years of, you know, youth programming at the global level that really focuses on the conversation around youth engagement. And so it sort of trails off the timeline, but you'll see that just there's a lot of really solid effort to really focus on adolescents and youth and their engagement. If you go to the next slide, I know a lot of us have seen Hart's ladder of participation, but essentially wanting to put this here mostly because I think we're still, as a sector, especially as we're talking about SRHR, we're still, you know, kind of hovering. And again, I'm making gross generalizations, so please forgive me. But I would just say, if I were to put my finger on the pulse of some of this, I would say we're still in kind of a 5, 6, 7. You know, especially when it comes to youth-led advocacy and youth-led organizing and support for both of those things. And if you're not familiar with Hart's ladder, we'll kind of go into it in the next slide a little bit further, but the whole idea is moving from adult-centered, adult-driven, even adult ally-focused, you know, initiatives to ones that are driven by and shaped by and monitored by, you know, young people and their peers, and you know, where there's robust support for youth-led initiatives from the beginning. So yeah, just the classic Hart's ladder participation for just to ground us a little bit. The next slide. So this is sort of taking Hart's ladder a little bit deeper, and this comes from a USAID publication, Youth Engagement in Development, which we can actually share after this also. But essentially saying that, you know, moving away from youth engagement that's sort of ad hoc, initiated by adults, you know, framed around consultation, you know, kind of an afterthought, like I was saying earlier, focused on individuals, you know, to one that's much more sort of thought out, planned out, where there's sort of good process to really find and, you know, and engage with, you know, a really robust conversation with, you know, with young people, but also driven by young people, that thinks about, you know, youth programming in a partnership model. And you know, I have some thoughts about that I'll share in a few minutes, but one that's sort of not extractive, that's not prescriptive, that's, you know, really trying to get at the root of, you know, a vision for youth-led initiatives that are really centered around, you know, the youth perspectives and experiences, and much more sort of institutionalized within an organizational mandate. So, you know, so that's not like a youth investment here, a youth program there, you know, an advocacy campaign there, but what are different organizations and stakeholders in the sector really trying to push forward more broadly, rather than just sort of, you know, pins here and there. So I, like I was saying with the latter, I feel like we're kind of making moves from left to right, and it's, you know, unclear kind of depending on what we're specifically discussing, where it is along the line. But the overall message is that I do think there's some really good progress in the conversation about youth engagement. So going to the next slide. So I was really fighting with a visual last night that I couldn't actually get into this presentation, but this is supposed to accompany a funky kind of arrow visual. So apologies that it's just words, but this comes from the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing from 2016. And this is just some of the accompanying factors that really sort of create an enabling environment for meaningful youth engagement. And this is one example of some evidence that's starting to emerge, being framed in the Lancet. So noting that these four kind of buckets, these four requirements, so training and mentorship, platforms and mechanisms for engagement, sensitization to political and management processes, and then resources, specifically refer to, you know, sort of different levels of prep that preparation that you know, institutions or, you know, stakeholders who are working with young people should just keep in mind. And each of these buckets could be their own entire webinar. So I'm sorry to be glossing over these really quickly, but essentially just to say that, you know, as we continue to talk about youth engagement for SRHR in this sector, there are a lot of factors, I think, that really contribute to, you know, sort of successful and meaningful engagement. And it's very contingent on context, as we say here in this slide, so social, cultural, economic, and political. So no one's pretending that this is an easy, quick thing, but, you know, we should still do it. So to move on to the next slide. Yeah, so essentially, I wanted to just take a quick second here to say that the Torchlight Collective, we've been working really closely with two youth-led SRHR advocacy coalitions in Kenya and Tanzania. And we've put together some quick learnings from that work together. And I draw some of these learnings and approaches from that work. And there is, if you'd like to read the full report, it will make much more sense than sort of a quick hit review here. But I just wanted to kind of walk through those really quickly. And just some things that really emerged for us. So if you go to the next slide, Lisa, and a lot of what I put here also is, it's a lot of questions, and I don't know if folks on the line will find that to be helpful, but essentially what I'm trying to do here is frame that we are also midstream in some of this learning, and you know, there's some really solid value in questioning where it all is, where the sort of the status of youth engagement the conversation is. And so a lot of these are just posed here, and we have some answers based on our work in Kenya and Tanzania, and are not trying to, you know, assume that they're universally applicable, but want to sort of put some grounds on that. So I would just say that one of the main things that in our efforts to support coalition building, for folks on the line who've been parts of coalitions, I imagine many of you have, you know that, you know, coalition building generally is challenging. It comes with all sorts of fun adventures, and there are some key considerations that we found specifically with youth coalition building that just wanted to pull out. So essentially, we found that we worked with a group of organizations and said, hey, are you guys interested in working together? And if the answer is yes, you know, let's move forward from there. And it involved some really solid questioning at the beginning about what everyone's already doing and, you know, what their priorities are. Like, it started from that place, and it sounds so simple, but often, you know, the coalition building with youth organizations is, you know, driven by a partner or a donor. And so there's often priorities that are already set. And so we found that it was really important to really start from, you know, and say, what do you guys want to do together? Do you think this would strengthen your impact? Do you think it would, you know, make your advocacy more effective? And then, you know, the next top major things that came out were also were related to resources, so funding, and, you know, noting that a lot of the youth organizations that come to the table are not funded organizations themselves, right? Like, they're not sending a representative who is a paid staff person always, or, you know, they're often a volunteer, or they're an underpaid staff person. And so with, you know, a full plate of their own, you know, organizational priorities. And so how do you then, you know, navigate a coalition space where, you know, there already are some serious resource constraints? And then what are the power dynamics? I mean, I think, you know, the youth-led coalitions that we worked with, you know, there are a lot of opportunities to really think about, you know, like a gender lens to leadership. You know, what does feminist leadership look like? What are, you know, some dynamics between young people who are based in a city center versus out in different counties or districts, and what are those dynamics, and how can those be navigated? And so just to say that, you know, that's definitely, those two are kind of major pieces of the coalition building. I know I'm running late on time, so I will speed this up. The next slide, Lisa, is, yeah, I mean, I know that there are a lot of models for youth leadership building. And so we really tried to kind of distill some of the main components or the main questions that we wanted to be asking, and we were looking at different leadership approaches. And, you know, it really comes down to sort of four main pieces, or four main big questions. The first being, you know, what are some assumptions about leadership generally? How can, you know, when you're working with young people, you know, they're not, you know, 30 years into their career having to, you know, work through old habits. Like, how can some of it be built from, you know, from a newer perspective in their careers to include, you know, good leadership practice. And sorry, just to also say that we were looking at leadership programs, so that's why we say program in here. Just looking at does the program really help each individual young person look at their own sort of leadership style and how they interact with others, and how they, you know, can sort of serve their community, bring their skills back to the community if there are, you know, if they have opportunities to, say, go to Women Deliver or go to different regional sort of policy making spaces, or how can they bridge those gaps, basically. Next slide, Lisa. And then, yeah, how, you know, there's a lot of, you know, having come from Women Deliver, where I worked on the Young Leaders program, there's a lot of really good programming for individual young people that I think, you know, really sets them up to not only go places in their career, but also be effective leaders in their community. And how can those individuals really link into a more systems approach? How can we look at, you know, social justice issues as, you know, these large mechanisms? And then also, like, are these programs youth friendly? Like, there are just some basic things that make some of this information more accessible to young people who are working in a range of different contexts, who have a range of different language, you know, language skills. And so, you know, how can we make sure that it's getting back to not only, or that the work that's happening with individual leaders is getting back to their communities. And then the third, sorry, Lisa, next slide. And this is the same little rant I just went on, but essentially, you know, once individual young people have their quote unquote capacity built, as if it's, you know, sort of a goal, you know, once there is that capacity building moment or leadership building moment, are there resources for young people to really implement their, you know, their ideas and put these skills into practice? Is there support to do this? And as partners, are we fostering, you know, and bolstering their vision and making sure that this is still, you know, like basically using the resources that, you know, non-youth allies have, you know, to really sort of support that vision, rather than making it about an organizational or institutional mandate, which I know is hard in the context of partnerships because everyone has their own mandate. And also, I think most importantly, is there space for failure? Is there space for learning? I think, you know, I had some really, really good support from folks when I was a youth advocate who sort of, you know, supported me as I made mistakes. And, you know, it makes a huge difference. I'm sure a lot of us can say that in our careers. So with that said, the next slide, Lisa, is really about funding. And I do encourage folks to read this learning series document in particular, because I think that there's, you know, it's more than obviously just sort of funding and sending resources in one, you know, one direction. So I think that in an effort to kind of keep this moving and make sure we have time for questions, just to say that, you know, we really put some thinking into how funders, and that could include INGO partners who subgrant to youth organizations, you know, how those resources flow makes a huge difference. And the support that young people have, in addition to funding, you know, makes a huge difference in you know, the coalition work or the program itself, or, you know, so really prioritizing that. And there's just so many opportunities to kind of design these processes with young people, with a diverse group of young people, in a way that also is transformational for the youth advocates that you're working with, because, you know, they're involved in the process, but then also, you know, gaining their perspective and hopefully improving, you know, a system that they're hoping to access. And I also, one thing I just also want to say too here is that, you know, there are some, I think, really good opportunities for donors, especially foundations, to kind of work together and help to set a solid baseline for what we mean by meaningful youth engagement and what some of those standards are. And that's sort of what I was saying earlier about the evidence and data for supporting youth engagement. So next slide, sorry to fly through that one, but I wanted to put these here. These tips come from a toolkit that Torchlight worked on with TCI that we link to at the end of the presentation. So I won't read these out loud, or I won't read the whole thing, but essentially really reiterating that, you know, youth engagement does need to be diverse. It does need to, you know, reach the hardest to reach, to ensure that the programs are reaching the hardest to reach, or that the policies are responding to the hardest to reach, and really prioritizing that diversity and representation. The second here that I also just want to say, there's a lot of expectations, I think, that young people will inform programs and policies just, you know, on a volunteer basis. And in a lot of cases, this is their expertise. In the same way you would never ask a professional to just sort of, you know, contribute their you know, razor's edge expertise, you know, just without, you know, remuneration. It's unfortunate that we live in capitalism, and that's another webinar, but, you know, I'm just to say that as we're going to young people to inform our programs and policies and funding priorities, we want to make sure that, you know, we're compensating them for their work. The next slide, Lisa. And this is particularly from the toolkit. There's youth participation and engagement is obviously not the only piece. And so we talk about this in the toolkit. What is the full landscape of youth engagement with, you know, making services youth friendly, making information available, you know, combating stigma and discrimination for young people who go to access services, particularly young women. So I, again, really encourage folks to read the toolkit. And then, you know, to one of the major pieces, and this is sort of a at the crux of human-centered design approaches that I know are really, you know, sexy for the right reasons, you know, with adolescents and youth, is that, you know, you need feedback loops. You need to make sure it's informed by, you know, the perspectives and expertise of young people. And so really encouraging different touch points along the way to make sure that happens. Next slide, Lisa. So what's next? So essentially, we just wanted to put here, you know, again, some of this is quite obvious, but you know, consulting with young people. And again, there are entire resources about best practice around that, so we can share those. I think number 2 here, this is something that I know that Rutgers and Right Here, Right Now, some really great partners are really prioritizing youth researchers, and just I really am excited to see what that ends up meaning for our sector, just in terms of the questions that get at that, you know, we're asking the research questions, in terms of who we're able to reach. So I think I'm really interested to see that. Integrate young people throughout the life cycle. We said this earlier, making sure that there are those feedback loop touch points. And then for those of you on the line who are from NGOs and UN agencies or foundations, you know, this is sort of what I was saying earlier about there being a really good moment right now to, you know, embed these principles within your organizational and institutional mandate. So where does this all fit in? What's the North Star around youth engagement? Why are you doing it at all, right? Like, how can, you know, we encourage partners and stakeholders in our sector to really kind of, you know, turn inward and go in-house and like budget for this properly and do some planning around it and really sort of interrogate that from an organizational perspective. Then the next slide, Lisa. Again, these are the takeaways again. You know, just going back to the fact that this is a lot about power, and really encouraging folks to think about that and look at that. And that, you know, like I said in the last slide too, that if youth engagement is going to be meaningful, it shouldn't be an afterthought. And, you know, I'm really excited to see what evidence and data start to appear in our sector as we do things like involve youth researchers and really think about our research questions as a community. So those are the takeaways. And then the next slide, Lisa, I think is the last one. Just wanted to include these links here. This is 2 links to the learning series that I referenced, and encourage, you know, there's a much better layout of all of this content. And also the this TCI toolkit that we worked on adolescent and youth SRHR. So those links are there. And yeah, and then there's also, we talked about this really briefly, or I actually realized I did not mention this yet, but there's a really good, I think, webinar coming up next week on youth participation and leadership that is a review of a report of the Youthled project, which is youth inclusion, engagement, and leadership development. and the findings are really, really fascinating. So encourage folks to join next week. Yeah, so thank you, smiley face. And thanks, Lisa, for being a fantastic button pusher. You did great. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. We appreciate your time. We've collected a number of questions in the chat box and the Q&A. So I was going to start with the first one that I saw, which was related to the Lancet series. So on slide 17, you mentioned that I think it was the third bucket, sensitization to political and management processes. And Kate Cho wondered if you were saying that youth need to be sensitized to this, or that political and management processes need to be sensitized to youth.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I believe it's both, in the sense that, you know, a lot of reasons, for example, why there's a youth pre-conference before a big meeting is just to say, like, here's the landscape, here are the players, here's the, you know, here's the schedule, you know, just really kind of making sure that young people are set up to participate in a process or environment, because, and given sort of some solid information about how to do that. But then also, you know, there are so many processes that are not youth friendly. And so I see the second as being aspirational. In that sense, it would be fantastic if these, you know, political and management processes were responsive to youth, and I think they can be. But I believe that the in the Lancet series, they're specifically talking about the first one, just orienting young people to these, you know, wonky systems that exist, or non-wonky, but just to the systems and processes that exist.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. And another question coming from Morgan Garcia. Are you able to talk about examples of good leadership models that upend hierarchies and prioritize youth? Can you point to any resources for developing such a leadership model?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I don't mean for this to be a plug for our learning series, but the youth leadership section of that does give some good examples, and happy to find more. We wanted to keep the series fairly, it's the pink one, Lisa, if you click on that one. So there's some good examples in there and some good links that we can provide. Also, if you would like more information, basically, once you read that, we may have some other resources too. And you know, there's some good case studies, I think, out there of specific programs, and trying to think of one that pops to the top of my head, but yes, and I know, Lisa, I know there's also some good case studies in the toolkit as well.
Yeah, I'm just helping to show my screen for those who might be new or miss certain parts of this, but especially related to the next question, which was, when you mentioned it's difficult to measure the impact of youth engagement programs, do you have any best practices on how to do this, or examples of what clearly doesn't work in youth engagement? And so I was just moving us to the youth participation and engagement section of the AYSRH toolkit, because I know that Lindsay mentioned Rutgers, and they have some really great tools, and I think it's actually under data management, that might be of interest to the team. Are you on the right track? And a toolkit for involving people in SRH research can both be found there. But do you have any examples of best practices for how to measure the impact of youth engagement programs?
I think this is part of the struggle, at least from where I sit. There may be folks on this webinar. I think Miranda might be on here from Rutgers. And so I don't know if Miranda, not to put Miranda on the spot, but I think that one of the challenges, and again, not to keep talking about challenges because I appreciate solutions, but I think that one of the things that we found is that there are a lot of theories and models for some basic standards of youth engagement, but I have yet to see some sort of like fully agreed on, principles that then can be measured, that like there aren't a set of indicators. There are a few, like I know FU 2020 put together a global consensus statement. PMNCH has done some work on this as well. There's a lot of good papers about, that sort of follow kind of Hart's ladder and look at some of those theories that we talked about here, but there aren't sort of universally applicable best practice standards that I've seen. And again, like there probably are for example, for the work that Rutgers is doing around youth-led research, like there is a methodology, there's good practice. And so there are, I would say probably, context specific and approach specific best practice. But one of the things I would love to see, and that we've also chatted with, Miranda chatted about at Women Deliver, is, really pulling all of that together and putting forward a set of indicators so that, there aren't sort of youth engagement efforts that are, on one hand doing, if there are 10 steps, for example, of like best practice, that, you have one on one hand doing, 5 steps and another sort of program doing 7 steps, and there isn't, but it's all being called youth engagement. I'm not sure if my point's coming out, but basically that I haven't seen some really solid, universally agreed on indicators and standards. And I think we really need that.
Thanks, Lindsay. And we hear from Jane about how do we create agency among youth to take on family planning, any experiences from TCI? And that's an exciting question, Jane. We operate in 4 geographical hubs, what we call them. So we have an East Africa hub in 3 countries, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. We're in Francophone West Africa in 5 countries. We're in India in 3 states, and then in Nigeria in 10 states. And youth engagement and participation is a definite cornerstone of our activities, as well as, trying to make AY data visible so that we can also say something to what kind of impact we're having related to our youth interventions. And so we hope to have a follow-up webinar on some of those experiences and success, maybe within a 6-month to year time, given that the programming is still a bit on the more nascent side. So, but so far we've seen that having youth transformational leaders programs in Francophone West Africa has been very successful. And the Nigeria program has identified and selected life planning. They call them LPAY, so life planning for adolescent and youth ambassadors, and have embedded those young people within different state and community structures to help not only give voice in those in those structures, but also to give them exposure to how those processes and systems work to build their skills around how they can best contribute in those areas. So more to come with that. Another question that's come in is from Saidia. Any experience, if you can share, about youth leadership models in humanitarian settings? That's a good question.
That is a really good question. And I would love to follow up with you on this. I need to do some digging, but I know that there's some really good kind of peace building work that young people are leading. So Sadia, maybe let's follow up after this, because I need to go back to my colleagues, because I know that there are some good ones. Yeah.
Great. And we've noted the question down, so we will try to address that. And then this is a good question, just knowing the sensitivities in the majority of cultures and low and middle income countries. What has been some of your experience in engaging parents for youth engagement?
I don't have, we tend to work with young people who are, sort of 19 to 30, and either, many of them kind of, I'm the term I keep wanting to say is older young people, who are sort of a little bit more removed from their parents' direct influence. But I know that there's some, especially for young people who are doing peer education programs or, work, community level work with their peers, that is definitely a strong consideration given the role that parents play in, especially the lives of adolescents, and including, adolescents from, 10 to 19 essentially. And so I don't have direct experience with this specific piece, but I know that there are some really good programming and really good engagement with parents, noting that they have the power to often torpedo the whole thing if they don't think it's appropriate for their kid. So we can also follow up on that as well. I want to look for that. Yeah.
And this conversation has been really helpful because Miranda from Rutgers is here and on the presentation. And she said that one thing that we do is use M&E tools to measure meaningful youth engagement, both during the program and in the end evaluation. So I provided a link to the Explore, a toolkit for involving young people, but she has additional tools specifically. And she said that she'll push internally to try to get those tools available online to make this happen. So thank you, Miranda. If you can keep us posted, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Miranda. I didn't mean to put you on blast, Miranda. I'm glad you're here. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we have about 8 more minutes, and I think I saw the main questions in the chat. So now I'm moving to the Q&A box. We're also new to Zoom, so I'm trying to take in all the different areas in which questions are coming. So thank you for your patience. We hear that, thank you for a very informative presentation. Can you please broadly define sexual and reproductive health and rights? What areas come under it? In your experience, when you talk about sexual reproductive health of adolescents and youth, what main areas are you focused during the youth programming? And just to say from a TCI perspective, we are somewhat defining that narrowly compared to WHO. We recognize the importance of the whole individual in a very holistic approach. And I think our programming through a meaningful youth engagement is attempting that. Unfortunately, how our donors are going to measure our success, though, tends to be more on contraceptive use. Mm-hmm. So although menstrual hygiene is really important and a number of other areas, we just want to be upfront about, and in our presentation at the beginning, we said like what our goal is, and that's largely from that point of view. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to.
Yeah, there's so many good questions. Thanks, everyone.
This question also involves like, how do you make sure there is effective youth engagement where cultural, legal, and religious factors are sensitive and key determinants of certain desired outcomes? And the person gives the example specifically of thinking about from the point of view of Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. And I think in Lindsay's presentation, she mentioned that a lot of this is all context specific. So although the goal in the heart ladder is to get us to, I think, level 8, in some contexts, it might not be feasible to start there. And that's why, it's a continuum. Mm-hmm. But yeah. I'll go back to that. But if you have any other thoughts on that, Lindsay, specifically?
Yeah, just to say that, there are a lot of young people who are working on a range of SRHR issues like access to safe abortion, you know, like HIV, that do involve some really sensitive content, and especially in a cultural context. And I, you know, one of the ways that I actually really believe in youth-led coalitions is that I see their, first of all, a strength in numbers kind of thing. You know, if you're working against an opposition, you know, there's some, you know, the more the merrier, in the sense that you need everyone to support, and especially, you know, on issues like abortion, it's so divisive. But you know, youth coalitions have a really, I think, important role in that, the ecosystem of that conversation, in the sense that they're often able to really push on some of these issues. They're, you know, as a voter, as a, you know, as a constituent, but also as an advocate. And there are ways to build partnerships with other non-youth organizations who are also doing the same, that hopefully gives them some cover. And that, you know, and it's obviously an imperfect system. There's a lot of variables there, but, you know, in as much as we can encourage kind of healthy youth-led initiatives, healthy in the sense that they're, you know, strong and robust, you know, that it makes a huge difference in the impact, and noting that obviously even measuring advocacy outcomes is hard generally. I mean, how, you know, attributing policy change, and I think we're getting better at that as a sector. It just factoring in how youth-led initiatives contribute to that success, I think is still something that folks are grappling with.
And I think I can maybe, we have 4 minutes, so maybe 2 last questions. Do you have any examples of how to institutionalize youth engagement, or know of any organizations that are doing it particularly well?
So there are a lot of examples of this, and many, you know, the trick here is that a lot of it is internal, you know, strategic planning type stuff. A lot of the folks that we work with as clients are looking at this question as well. So there may be some examples to share as follow-up, because some of it sharing at this point is talking about some of our clients. So but the answer is yes.
Okay, great. And then another question would be, do you see donors moving into the right direction in terms of responsive funding mechanisms? Are there good examples within the donor community that should be copied?
Yeah, yes, I think that there is a general move in the right direction. This is something that also Miranda and some folks who are working on the yield report, you know, we're asking these. Was it Miranda who asked this question? That would be funny.
Yeah, it was.
Busted. No, I think that there are some good examples. I think that part of the challenge is sort of synchronizing some of their efforts. I think there's a lot of really good donors who believe in youth engagement and who have to make the case to the, you know, their founder that, you know, it's a worthy endeavor. And this is sort of gets back to what we're saying about evidence to support youth engagement. I think a lot of these foundations do want, you know, they need evidence to show that investing in youth engagement leads to certain things. And I think we're still trying to develop that as a sector. And so there's no perfect example, but I do believe that donors are really trying to really get this right. And it's sort of a transitional moment right now that is exciting. A lot of questions being asked, which is great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just, we had one participant share that FP 2020 has an adolescent youth arm that does a good job at engaging youth and adolescents in regards to training, resource mobilization, project implementation through youth focal points in its commitment countries. So that's an example where maybe it's been institutionalized. Yeah. And then since we are at about the hour, I just wanted to remind people of the resources and that this has been audio recorded. And in a few days, we will send out the presentation and the audio recording. And we will do our best to gather maybe a list of resources that we've mentioned that helped go into the presentation, as well as others based on today's questions. So we really thank Lindsay for all her time. It's been a busy season with Women Deliver just ending, and we appreciate your time today and sharing Torchlight's experience, and we appreciate all the wonderful questions and everyone who's joined in on this important conversation. And as we mentioned, the conversation is never over, so we welcome you to continue it either by joining TCI University's AYSRH community of practice and sharing thoughts and resources that way, as well as joining next week's webinar that IBP and the Youthled project are hosting on youth participation and leadership in SRH. So thanks again, everyone, for a great time. It's been great to spend this last hour with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, TCI. Take care.